the great conservative movement of America and of our time. A brush fire of freedom is being lit all over this country. We, as an irate, tireless American populace, will overcome the few radical leftists that control the levers of power today. Joe Biden's failed economic policies has given us inflation like you can't believe, and the border is in disarray.
It's amazing how few of the people commenting on this have actually bothered to go see what's happening. Well, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona actually went to the border.
Biggs, where's Andy? Boy, oh boy, Andy. There's a guy. He's tough.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of What's the Biggs Idea? I'm Andy Biggs, Congressman from Arizona's 5th Congressional District. This is my semi-regular podcast, and I'm delighted to have people who agree and disagree join and view us today. But I'm especially grateful for our guest today, Mike Howell. Mike works with Heritage Foundation. He is the originator, actually mastermind behind something called the Heritage Oversight Project. He might tell us a little bit about that as we go along. He previously worked in the Department of Homeland Security, Office of the General Counsel in the Trump administration. Prior to the Trump administration, he was on Capitol Hill for 5 years as an attorney for both Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee and the House Oversight Committee. A graduate of Duke University and Emory Law School. And we're going to talk about several things today. We got some actual interesting stuff that's going on in Congress today and around the country. But you and I were talking beforehand, and I think it's important for people to understand this notion of leverage. I've talked about it before in some of my podcasts. I've written about it in many of my op-eds. I talk about it publicly because I do believe one thing that never gets taught in the graduate level work that I did in international relations, political science, none of that actually discussed what I call political leverage. And I wanted to get to that with you, Mike. Tell me what you're thinking about that with leverage in Congress.
Right. So as things are heating up to a boil here, whether it's Hunter Biden on one hand or Secretary Mayorkas and his impeachment process on the other, the oversight situation really isn't that complicated from a legal perspective or a process perspective. It's best to understand the House of Representatives is just a majoritarian body. The majority wins every time. Of course, there's some complex rules that are intended to confuse people along the way. But the simple fact is more people have to vote to either hold Hunter in contempt or Mayorkas in contempt and to impeach him than vote against for it to work. And so to do that, you need political will, you need unity, and you need leverage. And the leverage component is the one that we've seen whittle away, honestly, since this Congress gavelled in. Every step along the way in terms of setting up these processes has been intended to kind of remove that leverage from what I view as the more conservative wing of the party and folks aligned with primary voters and the base's interests. And so you've seen chairmen that have lost power at the expense of leadership taking power and becoming the ultimate decision makers. So a couple examples to just illustrate this. Remember when you all were about to hold FBI Director Wray in contempt of Congress? The contempt report was written. It was a beautiful report by the House Oversight Committee. It was over a simple thing. Christopher Wray refused at first to acknowledge the existence of a FBI form that had 17 instances of recordings of Hunter and Joe discussing corruption. He later admitted that it existed. Congress subpoenaed it, and Comer told Wray, if you do not give this to us, we will hold you in contempt. Clear as day. The threat was made for weeks, and we had this build-up crescendo up until the day he was due to turn it over. Well, what happened the eve before that, out of left field, then Speaker McCarthy comes out, negotiates directly with Wray, and says, guess what? You don't have to turn it over. The best you have to do is show a redacted copy of the document in camera to our members off the hook. So that is an example of the lack of leverage. You had Comer and the Oversight Committee charging hard, and in the last minute, the leverage was removed by leadership. And why? The answer to that is because with this need for a majority vote to advance things in the House, political problems are presented. The margin is so slim right now, and so many of your colleagues, sir, I dare say just don't agree with the direction of these things and the state of corruption and the need for accountability, that they would vote no on the floor potentially. So what's that? Who's that created a problem primarily for? Leadership. And so when you vest the decision-making power through that political lens in this small amount of hands there, you're going to get leverage loss along the way. And we're seeing this play out with Hunter and with Mayorkas. The fact that it's January of 2024 and we've had record-setting illegal immigration for 3 years right now, purposely and intensely created, maintained illegally by the Biden administration. It's frankly a joke that we waited this long. And it's because they didn't want to do that in the first year of this Congress, because they thought, for one, it would be better timed politically going into an election year. So forget about securing the border. It's just politics at the end of the day and timing. And that they didn't have enough votes to get there. So they were being held hostage by a small amount of people who oppose it and would be going on MSNBC and other places to say it's a bad idea. And so leadership didn't want the headache. I'm glad to see it's finally moving forward now with new leadership, but it's a day late and $1 short. And Mayorkas knows that there's no leverage. That's why he's not showing up to the committee hearing that you all invited him to. And he's likely going to have to be held in contempt. And he's calling the House's bluff, saying, I don't think you guys have the votes to do it. I saw Hunter just show you guys up this week. I'm going to do the same thing because I know at the end of the day, there's enough of your guys that are probably going to vote no and don't want to do this because there's so much lack of unity in the conference. And hey, by the way, also, I have senators on the Republican Party on my side now. I'm having coffee and lunch with Senator Langford later to discuss a border trade-off deal. So I have the leverage. You don't. That's what we're seeing play out.
Yeah. So, I mean, leverage is an interesting thing. So the two things that you brought up, Mayorkas impeachment and the Hunter Biden contempt. Let's talk the Hunter Biden contempt first, because I think that's an easier sell to the New York delegation. I mean, because that's real easy. Hunter Biden received a subpoena. The committee was authorized to issue the subpoena. They gave him a date and time and location. His attorney acknowledged the date, time, and location. And then deliberately, Hunter, with the assistance of Eric Swalwell, sets up a press conference at the exact same time. But apparently the Democrats knew he wasn't coming in because Representative Ivey from Maryland testified yesterday that they knew that he said we knew Hunter wasn't coming. So apparently they knew he wasn't coming, but they didn't do anything to continue or try to shelter him. And he went out and said, yeah, I'm supposed to be in a deposition and I'm not going to be in the deposition, right? So that's really pretty easy as far as contempt goes. And so the leverage there becomes, I think there's more leverage to get that through, because even the people who don't want to see an impeachment or something like that have told me, yeah, that's pretty blatant. That's pretty obvious. And the person who lost leverage there was Hunter Biden, in my opinion, through bad legal advice, bad PR advice to go out there and hold that press conference. And then I thought it was actually kind of a crazy stunt yesterday as well, to go in and sit there for 10, 15 minutes, which is all he was there, and then flee because people were, two of our very strong members were going to be asking him questions. He didn't want that. And it undermined everything, his whole narrative. His narrative was, I am here, I'm willing. And guess what? You bolted out of there after 15 minutes because you didn't like what was being said. I think there's leverage maintained there still with regard to the contempt, and I think it'll actually pass next week. What do you think?
I think so. I don't think Hunter and his attorneys are worried about contempt. I mean, you're absolutely correct. The law is on your side. I mean, this goes back almost a century. 70 years ago, I think U.S. v. Costello, the first Supreme Court case that touched on this, the House has complete latitude to dictate the time, place, and manner of their oversight functions. And so there's no legal argument that the witness can choose how and where they testify. This is what got put Peter Navarro in leg irons by the FBI and Steve Bannon looking at jail time for. But where I think the problem arises for you all is what happens after contempt. Okay, Hunter's not worried about a contempt vote. What does that mean? He's going to point to a out of control weaponized House of Representatives looking at him, sob story. You can imagine that. What he knows will happen though is the House will have to take that contempt citation and do something with it. And the options are usually turn it over to the U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia. who is Matthew Graves, who's one of the hardest left, most weaponized actors in our federal government. There's 0% chance Matthew Graves takes that up. So he knows it's a dead end. And he knows the other options at your disposal, ranging from the use of inherent contempt, which is the House enforcing it themselves. And this has historically been done where the House has arrested people, held them in custody. He knows there's probably not political will to take it to that level. And obviously that would present a huge conflict of the branches situation with Secret Service versus legislative branch. And so he's thinking towards that stage. He's making a show now, but he knows the House isn't going to defund his dad's government over this because you guys don't have the leverage to do that. Well, you do, but your colleagues won't use it. I'll put it that way. And so he's playing there. And that's why I think he showed up, flipped the bird, and he knows he's ultimately not going to be prosecuted just like anyone else in the previous administration was.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I agree with you. He kind of shows up to be more emphatic, to double down on his contempt. I think that was what was happening yesterday. And so here's an interesting play that I've been kicking around. Haven't resolved in my mind this because I do think we're going to vote to hold him in contempt next week. Congress will. But from that point on, we lose some leverage because, as you say, whether it's Merrick Garland, Matthew Graves, whoever it is in the federal government, they're most likely not going to do anything. If it's Merrick Garland, he's in a bit of a box because he's prosecuting other people like Bannon, like Navarro, right? So he's in a bit of a box. And so because that doesn't look good. But my thought was the last thing I think the Democrats really want, and the reason I say this is because they've really laid a bluff line on us for about 2 months now, is for Hunter Biden to actually sit down before the television cameras under oath and us go through the suspicious activity reports with him, us go through the bank reports, bank accounts, us go through the emails that exchanges we've seen, us go through the FD 1023 from the FBI and maybe get the underlying FD 1023 that gave us the current FD 1023. All of those things, I just don't believe that the Democrats really do want that before the public because Hunter will either, because he's facing the charges in California. So the question there is, number one, is he going to say, well, I've got these criminal charges, so I can't really answer anything? Number two, is he just going to take the fifth? Or number three, is the memory going to be the problem? And the reason I say that, though, is that is a bad political move for the Democrats because when you see somebody who's literally up there, who's asked a question over and over again, like we saw with Hillary Clinton, 8 hours, right, on Benghazi. She says, I don't recall like 142 times, that type of thing. It's not convincing, right? It convinces people something other than your innocence. It convinces people of your guilt. And I think it would also inure to convict in the public, a court of public opinion, the entire Biden family who was receiving, enormous amounts of money from everybody from China, Ukraine, Russia, UAE, Kazakhstan. It's enormous. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think there is a potential to call a bluff that actually gives us one little pinch of leverage?
I think you're absolutely right. If you were to show up and say you sat down publicly, it would have been a bunch of pleading the fifth. I think you would have also seen intervention perhaps from Special Counsel Weiss or the Justice Department, leading on the Democrats on the committee to paint this as an interference into the proper workings of the Justice Department. The interesting thing there is the left has maintained it's all guns and taxes that Hunter's in trouble for when, I and the American people are focused on the influencing peddling. And so how can you claim the fifth for influence peddling and maintain the narrative that it's only guns and taxes, these routine violations that you're in trouble for? So it would have been in a pickle there, but I do think the DOJ would have intervened and leaned on this a little bit to scope out the testimony so they could have pointed towards some non-Hunter actor. One point, though, about the leverage, and this I think is hopefully something being discussed on Capitol Hill now, is what do you do with the contempt citation when it passes and who do you send it to? There's nothing in the law that necessarily says you have to send it to the U.S. Attorney in District of Columbia, Graves. There's a case that can be made that the proper recipient of it I know this isn't a perfect answer, is Special Counsel Weiss. Somebody who I think is a little, at least perceptively removed from the inner workings of the Justice Department. You and I know that's not true. There's also could be conditioned on saying it over on the appointment of an independent or special counsel. You might need another one just to handle this, especially given the fact, and I think this is a major fact that hasn't gotten enough attention, that Joe Biden is a fact witness to Hunter's contempt itself. If you recall, he called over to the White House before he didn't show up, said, "Hey, Dad, I'm going to break the law and flip the bird to these guys." And he said, "Go get him, son," pretty much. Obviously, I'm adding some color there. But that means Joe Biden should have no hands on this whatsoever, which makes it very difficult since he's the head of the executive branch. So I think there's a strong argument to condition the citations transmission to a party with a higher chance of enforcing it. And also, whatever happens there, it's going to kick off, secondary and tertiary effects of accountability. This is how Nixon ultimately went down. It was the cover-ups of the tapes, really, that did him in. And I think we're going to see a similar fact pattern play out, where there's going to come a moment in time where it is abundantly clear in the public's eyes, and it's already clear in mine and yours, that Biden and his Justice Department is weighing in to protect Hunter. And that moment may come when they refuse to enforce the contempt citation or something involved in that process in the oversight investigations that manifest from that misconduct.
Yeah, I mean, it's so now, and if we take a look at Secretary Mayorkas, right, and we consider, so he had at the same time, I sat on two committees, and we had the contempt citations in both committees at the exact same time. So I was really running back and forth. Which made for an interesting insight, because I'm there for Hunter Biden over there. And it's oddly enough, the Judiciary Committee was much more, quite frankly, much more refined and constrained and calm than the Oversight Committee, which was interesting because that's usually not the way. But at the same time, the Homeland Security Committee under Chairman Green was having a hearing on whether to advance a markup for a resolution of impeachment on Secretary Mayorkas. And I thought that was interesting. I was trying to keep up with that a little bit as I was going to, and I talked to the chairman today. And I question, so what's interesting to me is the speakers actually kind of moved this, and I think the previous speaker was inclined to do the same, away from Judiciary Committee into the Homeland Security Committee. I think that's because we had some people who just have said we're not going to impeach Mayorkas for anything in the Judiciary Committee. And I'm just being blunt, and I've kind of said that before. So, but in the Homeland, they have those people. That's the leverage, I think. When you and I start talking about leverage, that becomes a leverage point for the speaker and also a leverage point for the chairman. And I know where I think it's going to go, but where do you see that impeachment process going with Mark Green as the chairman of Homeland?
So I think Mark Green and his team have done a terrific job in gathering a body of evidence over particularly the last 6 months when they stood up. I think it was their 5-phase investigation. They produced a lot of receipts, talked to a lot of folks within Border Patrol and the other agencies that Mayorkas is essentially told to stand down. I think that case has been made to the American people. They understand that what is happening at the border is willful, and it's sustained, it's purposeful, and it has a political intent to it to fundamentally transform this country in a way that cannot legally be done. And so I think that proceeds out of the Homeland Security Committee without much event or fanfare. And I think Mayorkas, if he doesn't show, will probably be held in contempt at the committee level. The problem I forecast is when that goes to the floor, because this one has a lot of connective tissue to the funding negotiations that are going on. There's a huge decision hanging on over, House Republicans particularly, as to whether to fund the government or to, continue the border crisis essentially, and to continue the border crisis or not fund the government, not continue the border crisis, or extract some changes, which would be HR2 as at a bare minimum, and then continue to fund parts of the government. So how that all ends up, and if Republicans fold on this and get no HR2, they're going to be in and the Homeland Security is fully funded to continue everything they're doing throughout the year. I don't see a path towards successfully impeaching Mayorkas. I think the leverage is gone. I think a lot of Republicans will see this as like the end of the affaire de la border for their responsibility, and then start viewing it only through political and electoral terms of, we have 2 impeachments, we got to choose one. We can't just be seen as impeaching everyone. They'll be listening to the Frank Luntzes of the world and the talking heads on mainstream media, and try to convey themselves as wise and measured and whatnot, all while the border continues to be invaded for the 3rd year going into the 4th year in a row. That's how I see that breaking out, is unless you hold the line on HR2 and solve the border crisis there, all leverage returns to Mayorkas, and I think he waltzes through this without being impeached.
I agree with you. And I'm actually a little bit stronger than that in a couple of things. I think that you would probably, I'm going to lay something out for you and see what your thoughts are on it. And that's this. I love HR2. I actually have drafted components of HR2. I've carried, I think every one of those components sometime or another is pieces of legislation. And we passed it out of the House, and it's sitting over there in the Senate. The Senate's not going to do anything. But if you do a budget deal, which is what the speaker's doing, and it's he and Schumer have kind of reached this deal, and even if you put HR2 there, and Biden were to sign it, I think he just papers it. He just airmails around it. I think that what happens is you still end up with the massive amount of people coming across that you have. I think it's still facilitated. And that's what I mean. That's part of why Mayorkas is responsible here. He is facilitating and encouraging the illegal immigration. And you had somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000. You had over 300,000 encounters. You probably had 75 to 150,000 gotaways, known and unknown, because they're claiming 50. So the question would be ultimately, how do you do that for another 12 months? And I don't think you can sustain that for another 12 months without having actual foundational damage to your country changes, So my suggestion is you hold this administration accountable by Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security is going to always be funded, but then you fund other items that you have to fund. I mean, you make sure veterans are funded, the armed forces are funded, ICE, CBP, TSA, air traffic controllers, and then you kind of stop it right there. And then you might have a leverage point with this administration saying, we've now funded the government we're willing to fund, and we will not fund anymore until you actually start bringing, with measurable metrics, bring the border under control. I mean, what's your thoughts?
I think that's a creative way to do it. I mean, certainly the right potion here would be statutory changes plus funding restrictions and not funding the entirety of the operation. And so, I would love to see that. We can't even get the bare minimum now. I think we got enough, Republicans there that wouldn't go for that. That's a dang shame, because on the campaign trail, they would say that's absolutely all they would take. But now they're here in DC, they operate differently. But you're right. I mean, the American people are ready for that solution. I think that's a cross-party lines deal, is that the government is too big. There are functions that are out of control. Let's fund the things we need and not the things that we don't. But when you add in the border stuff, you're right. If we implemented all of HR2, would Biden faithfully execute every last piece of it? Absolutely not. And so there are things in HR2, though, that would give us recourse. We would reestablish the ability for states and others to sue to hold the government accountable, which was, just basically gutted a little bit by the Supreme Court.
Right.
Also, you cut off in HR2, this is a funding part of HR2, the $1 billion plus transfer of money from taxpayers to nonprofits to receive illegals and process them to the interior. So I think those two things on their own would severely limit the Biden administration's ability to proceed. As for the statutory changes, I mean, if you told me 4 years ago that parole authority would be used for mass class-based importation of people into this country, and for the viewers out there, there's this little thing in immigration law known as parole, which is not the same as, your buddy's on parole and in trouble. He's got to check in with the cops. Parole means, in the immigration context, there's a guy overseas who's got a crazy disease, and there's only one doctor in the world that can fix it, and he's in America. You parole that individual in. It's this case-by-case, last resort type thing. The Biden administration saw that and said, we're going to use this for tons of people, class-based parole. We'll say anyone who meets these criteria, you're paroled in, we'll fly you into the country. And so the point I'm trying to make here is, if we close those loopholes, which need to be closed by HR2, they're going to find the next parole. They're a lawless administration. They're not been held to account. The judiciary, works too slow at this rate to actually react to what they're doing in real time. And, it's no longer a neutral instrument in many instances with the lawfare we see. And so it is really hard legislatively to constrain them. And that's why you need the legislative, bottom floor, which HR 2 is. HR 2 is just the best that the House could get all the, we'll use the New York Republicans to say moderates on board with. You and I would take HR 2 times a zillion if we could get it. That represents as far as the Republican conference as a whole would go. But you need that plus funding restrictions for the next parole thing that they want to invent. And last point here, in the Senate, you're going to hear this talking point of HR 2 is crazy. It's far right. It's a wish list. It's aspirational. There's no way we can do it. It's a messaging bill. That is not true whatsoever. Again, it is what the moderates, the most moderate liberal, I will say, members of the Republican Party in the House agreed to. And now you have senators from red states, safe seats, negotiating far to the left of the most moderate members of the House, framing what they did as a wish list. And that is just absolutely cratering leverage of the House Republican Conference right now. I have no idea why the Senate is doing this. I think it's particularly harmful and with obvious intent and consequence to Speaker Johnson by undercutting his ability to hold the House line on this. And you have conservatives on the campaign trail, senators that are engaged in that fight. And Mayorkas is just lapping it all up right now, the disunity that he didn't even have to create. He just exploited.
No, that's right. And that's leverage. He sees an opening. He's stuck in a bar and he's leveraging it. And that's what's happening with Mayorkas. I agree with you. I don't think we have the horses. I mean, I think he does deserve to be impeached. I've said that for 2 years now. I mean, you can't go 3 years in a row. Every month practically is a record over previous, through history. No other nation, as far as I know, has gone through what we've done. And that's just with the encounters. You start throwing in the gotaways, known gotaways and unknown gotaways. And you consider what CBP does. If you have a group of 20 people that get away, you can't catch them. Maybe it's 50. And you write down, they will only report it as 20. They'll put it down as a 20 plus because that's the policy. And so you really have no idea. To me, I am so disgusted, quite frankly, with many of my colleagues. I view the border as an existential crisis. I view the spending levels as an existential crisis. We're at $34 trillion. And I think the spending bill that they want to do is going to give you a $36 trillion national debt next year at this time. And unbelievable to me. But, Mike, great insights. Appreciate talking to you. Appreciate what you do. Keep up the good work. Thanks for joining us today, everybody, both pro and con. But Mike, it's always good to visit with you, and we'll do it again soon sometime. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, sir. Keep up the good fight. We're rooting for you.
Thank you, sir. I will. With that,